Thank you for joining this session. I'm Sarah Jackson, Green Infrastructure Programme Manager at Battle North East Somerset Council. We've been asked to host this session for the Communicate conference. Introducing Mike Clemence, who's from Ipsos UK, who's going to be talking to us about half an hour about audience insights. So it'll be a half an hour presentation, and Mike's got some polls to share, so it's kind of interactive as well. Following Mike's presentation, there'll be time for questions. If you can put your questions in the question and answers and not in the chat, that would be really helpful for me to select out the questions at the end of Mike's presentation. But do use the chat for other things. So over to you, Mike.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah. And hello, everyone. Great to see you all. As I'm from Ipsos, I've invariably got some slides. So let me share those with you now. You should be able to see them all. And this session is all about public opinion and what people think about environment, climate change, and everything else looking forward over the next couple of years. I've done this slot for a couple of years now at Communicate, kind of investigating how people feel. And it's been quite an interesting development over the last couple of years that we've seen in terms of how people feel about the environment, how important it is, and how important they think it is that we take action on it as well. As I mentioned, I work for Ipsos UK. We are a large polling organisation. We're obviously quite busy today, trying to figure out what the public think of the reshuffle that we saw yesterday. But obviously we do a lot more work around that as well, a lot of work with government, and particularly actually tracking what's happening to public attitudes on important issues of the day. And of course, that includes climate change. And we've been looking at how people's values, so the slightly deeper held views they have about the environment and about lots of other things, have been changing through the last couple of years, which have been quite a roller coaster ride of change. And that's what I want to share with you today. As Sarah mentioned, there'll be a couple of polls to test, not necessarily test your knowledge, but to see how the opinion of the room stacks up against the British public overall, exploring how close your fingers are to the pulse, I suppose. And otherwise, we'll explore in a little bit more detail where people are at the moment, because I think it's quite an interesting moment for the environment. We're sort of past the surge of popularity about dealing with the environment following COP26. People now beginning to think a little bit harder about what it's going to take to get from here to net zero, and that results in some different types of questions and doubts arising than ones we might have seen before. So my talk's in about three parts. First of all, I want to give you that overarching view of where public attitudes are around the environment at the moment. You know, what's the cost of living crisis done? What are the geopolitical changes we're seeing doing to how important people think it is to deal with the environment and avoid climate change? Then, of course, next year being an election year, almost undoubtedly, you know, how important is climate change to the public when it comes to their vote choice? What are people looking for from the different parties, and how are they perceived on this issue? And then I wanted to finish with just a look forward slightly more, you know, where are we going to go next, and some informed guesswork perhaps about how public concern and public views on the environment and climate change might move into the future. So I wanted to start with the first of my three quiz questions. You should get a polling pop-up. Oh, there we are, right there now. So the question is, what proportion of Britons think climate change is one of the biggest issues facing the country? And you've got four options there, whether it's half, 14%, 7%, or 35%. And this is from our monthly issues index, where we ask 1,000 people over the telephone, you know, unprompted, what they think the biggest issues are facing the country. I can see that the votes coming in now. It's 35% looks to be the consensus view at the moment, just about, but quite a strong showing for 50% as well. I think we're 81% participation, which is very good. Much, you know, we could dream for that level of participation in our surveys, I think. There we are. And it's still coming in. I'll wait a second, see what people think. Okay, so we're at 90%. We'll probably draw it to a close there. And what we've got is half of people think that 35% of Britons would say that climate change is one of the biggest issues facing the country. Second then is 50%. So 30, it's a bit confusing, but 3 in 10 of the people in the room think half the public are really concerned about the environment. And then a smaller number of people, just 16%, think it's 14%. And the correct answer is actually that 14%. So perhaps slightly lower than the room expected. When we ask every month people what they think the biggest issues are facing the country, we still get quite a strong read on economics. So the cost of living crisis, inflation, those sorts of things are really top of mind. We ask people completely unprompted. We don't give them a list to check against. And you can see there the top two biggest issues are the economy and inflation. And then actually the things that we're seeing rising at the moment, it's not climate change and environment, it's public services, particularly the NHS. And also recently, we've seen an increasing concern about immigration, housing, and that general sense the government's not really looking after people properly. Climate change is a top 10 issue almost all the time. So we ask this question once a month. You can see it's there on 14% with education, poverty and inequality, but it struggles that top of mind billing that some of these other more pressing and more direct issues face or get when we ask this question. And actually, what we're sensing as well is a little bit of a sense, perhaps a relaxation of urgency compared with how we asked, how people responded to this question maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So we asked people, which of these statements best describes how you feel about climate change. A quarter of people think it's a serious global threat that is out of control, but actually 50% think it's serious, but there's still time to deal with it. There's a sense of perhaps less urgency amongst the public in dealing with climate compared with some other issues which are closer to their hearts and to their pockets. And actually, when we asked this question over the last decade or so, when do you think Britain will start feeling the effects of climate change? Obviously, since 2010, this has changed a lot. So, more people now say now rather than in the next 10 years. But, the last couple of years, it's gone down a little bit. So rather than being 3/4 of people saying we're already feeling the effects of climate change, it's now 2/3. And the proportion who say, we'll feel the effects later has risen slightly from 20% to 28%. So over the last couple of years, we've seen sort of a plateauing in the level of urgency that people give to climate change, perhaps compared with where we were, say, in 2021 or 2022. But I think that the key thing is that obviously there's opinions, things that are top of mind, the things that come to mind really quickly when you speak to people. But I think one thing not to lose sight of is the idea of protecting the planet, of dealing with climate change is a long-term value. So it's something quite strongly embedded in people, even if it doesn't always find expression. So to take an example here, we ask people quite a defeatist question. The idea there's no point changing my own behavior to tackle climate change because it won't make any difference anyway. And actually, we have more than half of people disagreeing with this. Underneath it all, people do think it's important. They do see a role for individual action. But actually, in the time we're in, and that's part of the thing I'm exploring at the moment, there's lots of other things competing for attention. And so you have this long-term goal of dealing with climate change, of thinking it's important, of thinking everyone has a role, bumping up against the reality of cost of living, of geopolitical issues, of all the other things that we see facing the country today. And to show that again, people think it's worth it. It's quite an interesting question we asked about whether people think the costs of measures to reduce climate change will be more expensive than the cost of climate change itself. So are the disasters and the weather issues that we're going to see going to cost more or less than the amount we might spend trying to mitigate and adapt to climate change? So it's an interesting question because it assumes a level of cost, of sacrifice either way. And when you ask people this, 4 in 10 say, the economic cost of climate change itself will be greater, therefore it's worth investing in adaptation, mitigation, and other steps to deal with climate change. And just a quarter take the other view. So it's quite a complicated picture. People, they're really worried about the economy, they're really worried about public services, but underneath it all, there is still a concern about climate change and a feeling amongst more of the population than less that these are sacrifices worth making, even if they're difficult. But I think there's an issue around cost particularly. And that points to this idea of a turning point. So over the last decade, we've asked people, are we headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly? From 2013 to 2020, we saw a very big shift. So from 59% to 83%, which was the period over which attitudes towards climate change moved from being quite American in the sense that there were a lot of skeptics, people denying the fact that it was even a problem in the first place, to 80% plus, which puts us level with countries like France, Germany, and Italy, where that argument is sort of won. And I think that's still the case here in the UK. People are broadly on board with the idea that we really ought to do something about the climate. But this sort of levelling off and gradual decline we've seen, I think, speaks to, a slight deprioritization, even though everyone still agrees it's important. And that's the difficult policy question that we're facing now, making space for taking action on climate when there's so many other pressing concerns. For example, we ask people, I'd like to do more to reduce climate change and help the environment, but I can't afford to. And that's a line that half of people in the country agree with. So there's a real sense of having to make difficult trade-offs here, and people often not being able to afford to make the changes that they think are necessary. And that speaks a little bit to the perception of climate being a little bit of a luxury, things that are good for the environment being more expensive than things that aren't. And we do a lot of work in our private sector industry looking at that particular question, because there's a sense of luxury, or at least greater cost attached to environmental products, which forms this mental barrier in people's heads. And of course, in a way, cost is quite an easy thing for people to say as a reason why they're not doing something. And I think actually there's also a problem of leadership. And we'll get onto that talking about the election in a second. But from our Earth Day polling earlier this year, we find 2/3 of people think Britain should do more in the fight against climate change. And it's a decent majority of people who think it's important that we're doing more. However, only 1/3 think Britain is a world leader in the fight against climate change. So, there's 1/3 of people there who think we should be doing more, but don't see our country as being on the front foot when it comes to dealing with the crisis. And in even fewer, just over 1/4, think the government has a clear plan in place for tackling climate change. So there's an issue around communication of plans, there's an issue around appearing to be leading, that probably, were it to be stronger, were people to get that message more clearly, would build on this underlying value, this sense that we really ought to do something. There's a definite disconnect here between the people and the leadership they're looking for on climate, which means in the interim they fall back on heuristics around cost and ideas that it's a bit too difficult, that has led to this sort of levelling off that we've seen in climate concern over the last couple of years. Moving on then to the election, Ipsos's favourite time of the year, which has happened quite regularly recently, although we've had almost 5 years since the last one, which feels somewhat unbelievable. And climate, of course, is one of those issues that people will be talking about in the run-up to the election whenever it happens next year. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on the position climate occupies currently in the broader list of issues that people will be thinking about when they come to cast their votes next year. So, we do political polling like everyone else. There is an election coming, and it is looking pretty bad for the government. Obviously, perhaps David Cameron will save everyone from the Conservative perspective. We will be tracking that over the next couple of days. But over most of the year, actually, what we've seen is that the Labour Party's had about a 20 percentage point lead over the Conservatives when it comes to voting intentions. And we ask people, if there was an election tomorrow, how would you vote? Roughly, we get about 4 in 10 people saying the Labour Party, and about 1/4 to 1/3 saying the Conservatives. And obviously we're a way out from the election. No one knows when it is. But if this result was repeated at an election, it would be a sort of 1997 style drubbing for the Conservatives. They've got a lot of ground to make up to avoid that sort of result. We expect probably, if an election is called, that things will begin to narrow. But certainly at this point, it's a very, very steep path for the Conservatives to maintain power. So they're obviously looking around to think about how they can prolong their time in office. But that background is quite important to think about, and it's been surprisingly level over the past year. But first of all, on to my second question. We ask people regularly what issue is going to be most important to them in deciding how they'll vote. So the second poll should allow you to pick one of these 4 options. So when we ask people what's going to be most important deciding how you're going to vote, which of these 4 options is the most commonly selected? Okay, it's an interesting race between the NHS and inflation, and climate change and immigration falling by the wayside. Okay, so it's almost a dead heat between NHS and health and inflation. So if we end the poll there, actually want to congratulate the room. I think that, you know, this was my trick question in a way, because actually both of these are the most important, and actually the room has got that almost exactly. We are very closely tied on whether people think people are most likely to select the NHS and health or inflation. So no, very impressed on how much you understand about the public. So recently, when we've asked this, obviously we're in a sort of a period where there isn't an election, so it's a little bit hypothetical. When we ask people, you know, which of these is going to be most important to deciding which party you vote for, it is healthcare and inflation which come out on top, and that echoes the result that I showed earlier, where those are the top issues people think are facing the country. Protecting the environment and climate change, again, that's sort of mid-table, not quite top 5, but definitely top 10 sort of position. So 10% of people say, you know, protecting the environment and climate change will be important in deciding how they vote. This, of course, can change quite a lot, particularly when we get an actual election and the issues that people are talking about become better defined. You can see at the bottom of this chart that 5% of people said Europe, EU, and Brexit would be an important factor. When we asked this just before the election in 2019, that was joint top with the NHS. So it's fallen a really long way, and kind of testament to how far the conversation's moved on from Brexit, following a global pandemic and everything else that's happened in the last couple of years. So definitely lots of potential for movement. I think, you know, the economy, inflation, healthcare, increasingly public services will be where the election is fought, and it's less likely that climate change will be one of the key issues. But it is certainly a really interesting issue. We've seen a lot coming out recently about how politicians are positioning themselves on the environment. That means that maybe this will be a part of the picture. And it's interesting as well, because when we ask the public, you know, which party has the best policies on different areas, environment's one which comes out as not being particularly well owned. You can see here, for example, well, the big picture is that Labour's seen as having the best policies on almost everything, which again is a symptom of that 20-point lead they have in polling generally. But they've got very strong ownership on housing, on healthcare, on education, on reducing the cost of living. But then right down the bottom, you can see actually it's just in the teens where either party is seen as having the better policies on the environment. So it's not going to be a sales pitch sort of thing for either party, that they know how best to approach the environment. I think that speaks a little bit to the level of consensus that we've seen for some time on the need to take action. In fact, you know, when we broaden the question a bit more, it's actually the Green Party, perhaps unsurprisingly, who are seen as having the best issues on the environment, but that's still only 3 in 10, which for a party that's very centered on the environment is very low, and speaks a little, I think, to the two-party system that we're in. But the idea of climate change being owned by other parties is one that we don't see, especially when we think about some of these other key issues that are going to define the election, like healthcare, you know, managing the economy, or inflation. As I mentioned, it's actually an area of relative parity. So 26%, a quarter of people say the government has done a good job dealing with climate change. This sounds quite bad, but actually in the context of how well people think the government's done anything, that's actually reasonably high. That's probably their third best perception in terms of policy areas, which reflects a little bit the position they're in right now. So the government's seen as doing an all right job on dealing with climate change. And I think also, when we ask about Labour, half of people think they'd perform exactly the same. They're not seen as having a better offer on climate. I think in a way that's sort of the fact that they're both committed to a lot of those big picture climate policies for the most part. They're both committed to net zero, although they might differ on how they get there. That it's an area where there's not too much differentiation on how they'd be seen to perform overall. But you know, again, it's that point of we agree on the basics. We know it's a problem. We know we need to do something, but how we deal with it is something that is coming into the political scene. So, you know, there's a picture here of a ULEZ camera, the ultra low emission zone in London, and the spate of sabotage that there's been on the cameras in the newly expanded zones, which was tied into the surprise by-election victory for the Conservatives in Uxbridge not too long ago. So there's clearly an angle here where, again, if it gets drawn into cost of living, then you know, people begin to take a slightly different view on climate. And similarly, the idea that now there's going to be an annual oil and gas exploration round that's announced each year, which apparently happened anyway, but now it's going to be more of a thing, which again is sort of trying to draw Labour into that conversation of climate versus job creation, and the SNP for that matter as well. So I think there will be a slight edge to the climate discussion, even though it might not be the primary area of contestation. It is becoming more political. And you can see that in our polling when we ask people about the steps they would support or oppose for getting towards net zero, frequent flyer levies, changing product pricing, more vegan options, low traffic neighbourhoods. On all of these, there is a real gap between supporters of the two main parties. Labour being supporters being more in favour of all of the above. When we change this question to say, well, what if it cost you money or meant you couldn't do what you wanted to do, both parties decline. But there is a real difference here, and it relates a little bit to sort of views on government oversight and government involvement in people's personal lives. But there is a definite angle here, and that is something that's being explored. And I think probably the most interesting chart that we've seen of this was about Rishi Sunak's U-turn cancellation of some of the net zero targets that the UK had in place until recently. When we ran the polling on this and asked people, did you think it was the right or the wrong answer, amongst those who'd heard of the policy change, actually the public split right down the middle. So I think there was quite a negative reception, the idea that some of these targets are being abandoned or postponed, getting rid of internal combustion engines in cars going from 2030 to 2035, certainly was received quite a negative reception in the press. When we looked at the public, actually, this is clearly an issue people are thinking about in terms of cost of living, in terms of how they adapt. There's a need to explain to people how they'll be able to keep up with adaptation, which otherwise does split the public quite strongly. So this, the cancellation of some of the net zero targets, the postponement of others was as popular as it was unpopular amongst the public, which speaks to that underlying tension around cost of living, which is something we could see coming into the conversation around the election when it's called next year. So for the final section then, I wanted to just finish on, where next the public attitudes towards climate change. We've seen that the last decade has been sort of a great explosion of people agreeing that it's a problem. We've got well past the idea that climate change isn't happening. People broadly, there'll always be some deniers, but as far as public opinion is concerned, we've got as much agreement as we ever will on the idea that this is an important issue that we really ought to do something about. But is that sort of exploring the next stage, the implementation stage, where people's appetite wanes and waxes based on the economy, based on what else is going on in their lives that we've entered now, which is a very interesting period to be in. And then my final polling question I want to bring up is just to ask the room, how confident are you that the government will meet its net zero target by 2050? We asked the public this, but I'm really interested to know what the level of optimism or pessimism is in the room here. Okay, that's a fairly consistent read. Was that half of people in the room are not confident at all that we'll hit net zero by 2050, and then a mere 44% are not very confident. We've got 9 optimists, or at least fairly optimists in the room, which I think is really, really interesting actually when we think about what we've committed to and how people think we're going to get there. Because the public are, if anything, slightly more confident, which I'm surprised about. But it's the same overall message. We find when we ask people in the run-up to our question about the U-turn on some of those net zero policies, we found a quarter of people were not confident at all, 43% not very confident. So that's 2/3 at least who aren't confident, and then actually about a quarter who were confident. So clearly there's an issue here about believability of the targets. And that then feeds into what we've seen already, which is people feeling like it's not necessarily the most urgent thing to do, or that cost is more important, or that other issues are more important still, because from the very top, there's kind of a disconnect between what we've agreed to do and what everyone thinks is going to be possible. There's this credibility gap, which again is something that's going to be potentially damaging to getting people to making the changes that might need to happen. And I think generally this is rack. This is the aerated concrete which caused such an issue in September. I think there's a feeling that there's concern that government and public services lack capacity and capability to protect people into the longer term future. When we asked earlier this year whether people were worried that government and public services will do too little to help people in the years ahead, we found 4 in 5 Britons agreed. We asked this in 50 countries. In every country, more than half of people agreed, but you then have to look at where each country ranks, and Britain ranks amongst Latin American countries and is slightly further ahead of many of our European neighbours. And I think that sort of the idea that there's a need to do more to think about the long term and to protect people into the future is something that really pervades a lot of public opinion right now, and when we will see coming up at the election as well, people needing to create perhaps a more positive future that people can then get behind in order to lend a bit more credibility to those net zero targets and take the steps that might be needed to reach them in the end. And I think it's also something that, the idea of enthusiasm is something we might not see getting resolved anytime soon. So again, in our polling, we ask about, what do you think about the two candidates? How do they make you feel? And one of the statements we ask is, do they give you confidence about Britain's future? And 18% of people say that about Rishi Sunak, so pretty low. He's having a hard time right now. Most of his personal capabilities aren't ranked very powerfully by the British public. What struck me as well, actually, is that Keir Starmer's not really doing much better on this measure. He does score higher on quite a few measures, about being in touch with ordinary people, about understanding the needs of the country. But that point on inspiration, on giving confidence about the future, he's actually pretty much level with Rishi Sunak. And this is what both of them, it's one of their weakest characteristics. So I think, regardless of what happens at the election next year, the public are looking for a bit more leadership, a bit more enthusiasm or excitement on climate specifically. And it's not clear that either party leader is going to be able to provide that. So that's sort of my overview there of what's happening in the world of climate change and public opinion at the moment. I think we're at an interesting moment. Like I said, I think we're in that implementation phase. The idea that if we're to hit these net zero targets, now is a building phase, a phase where lots of things have to be happening in order that later on we begin to move towards net zero, whether that's new energy grids, whether that's changing how people travel, whether that's removing cars from inner cities. There's a lot that needs to go on and won't necessarily show much, at least in the short term. And that's one of the challenges of leadership we're facing, that people are being asked to do things that don't provide an immediate return. And that's something that we'll come back to, I'm sure, over the coming years. But I think, if we're to step back and think about it from the top, climate action does remain a point of broad agreement. Agreeing on that idea of the fact that this is an issue that we need to do something about was comparatively perhaps easy. We got there in the end by about 2020. But actually, when it comes to implementation of net zero targets, that how becomes the real challenge. And that's where we see all those disagreements in the public. And that's something that we'll probably see playing out in the election as well. There's also that second point, that there are big gaps in what people think is enough climate action, enough sacrifice. And that is exactly the point that will become a bit of an election battleground as people talk about when will we need to get rid of gas boilers or cars with internal combustion engines. But it won't be the core. The core conversations we're expecting to see over the election will be about who's going to run the NHS, how are we going to fund health into the future, who's going to run the economy better. And that's actually, currently the economy perceptions of who can run it better, the Labour and the Conservatives are tied. So you can expect to see a lot of movement on trying to prove their credentials around the economy. And perhaps you can see David Cameron's reappointment to the government as part of that, as he's seen as someone who ran the economy relatively well, even if some of the other aspects of his legacy are more contested. And then thirdly, I think there's that point around leadership and communication. And what we see routinely is this is a change election. I think 2/3 of people, regardless of whether they think the government's done a good or a bad job, or whether they even think Labour will do a good or a bad job, say that this coming election is time for a change. And that's why we've seen headlines around Rishi Sunak trying to be a candidate of change and cutting HS2 and those sorts of things, because the public do feel like there's a need for movement that they feel hasn't happened recently. And that means there's an opportunity for projecting a hopeful green future image. this change can be a more environmentally sound one. But it's about trying to find out how to communicate that target better to help people feel that there's a plan that they can sign up to that will get us from where we are now to net zero in 2050, and maybe change some of the pessimism that we saw amongst the public and also in the room today. But with that, I'll probably stop for any questions, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I suppose some of us are not surprised by some of the results. I mean, I think somebody put in the chat, it's, that high figure of people think we are heading for environmental disaster has increased, 83%. It's quite a shocking figure. Very disappointing, but not unexpected that no party is really owning the green, the natural environment agenda. But what we'll do now, we'll go to the question and answers, where you were asked to put those questions. I know there's been a lot of conversation in the chat. We'll go through those questions that are put in the question box. If we have more time, we'll look at some of the chat. But Mike, I'm going to start with questions in the chat. Somebody was asking about, I think there must have been something about not asking over 75s in the poll. I'm just wondering why you don't ask the questions of that age group.
Sure, that's more of a methodological one, but basically, we use multiple methods to speak with the public. We use telephone polling and we use online panels, and you'll have seen a mix. So for our political polling, for example, we do use telephone polling where there is, anyone over the age of 18 is able to be contacted. For some of our other stuff, we use online polling, and what happens there is you have to limit the upper age limit, because as you go beyond that age, the number of people who are online who could conceivably be interviewed becomes less and less like the wider population. So it's more of a methodological thing. It's a broad measure of where the public are at, but yes, it does miss some of that older age group. We don't do that for our political polling, partially because when you think about how people vote, it's very strongly age correlated. So if you cut off the over 75s, who are a decent chunk of the population for political polling, you're probably likely to understate the Conservative vote share. But when we do broader societal polling, sometimes we use an online methodology, and that cuts off there, though, in our weighting. So the way that we then look at the data to make sure it's representative, we try to address that. But that's more a sort of an availability of who's online. And you can see, 5 years ago, we would have stopped at 65. But, as the population becomes more online, I think that will improve. But we just want to be, transparent on who we're speaking to. So some of them, whether online, it is a slightly different population.
And following that, somebody else, just asking, are there any particular trends in those different age groups, any disparities in kind of responses to some of those questions?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. I think there's a big discussion about, the young people, or Generation Z, like more environmentally conscious than others. We certainly get a lot of that in the press. And I think ultimately the answer is no. As you said, like we see 80% of people saying we're headed for environmental disaster. That's quite level across all age groups. But the one thing that's different and more difficult to do with survey research is to talk about behaviour and what people do in response. There's a sense perhaps that younger people might at least say they're more willing to take more drastic steps to protect the environment than older people. But in terms of action, that's a really unanswered question. I think it's very hard to say that young people are more committed to climate action than older people, just because they're actually much more likely to be disengaged with a lot of these topics, even though when we think about the press, we think of Greta Thunberg and influencers and people who are quite a small proportion of the overall young cohort who are very committed. I don't think they represent the wider group, and actually it's quite similar across ages.
Okay, and thank you for that. And a couple of people supported the question about, as communicators, obviously a theme of the conference, what channels are available for people to engage with your company, and how can they access the data that you've been sharing and probably other data that you gather?
So we have lots of data. This is something where we publish it. We publish a lot in the environment. We do Earth Day polling. We have some stuff coming out to coincide with COP28. It's all on our website. You can obviously message me, and we've got a whole team who work on the environment, but we're very keen to get our data out there. It's all on our website. I won't say our website's the best, but it is all there. And otherwise we have Twitter and X, accounts. We're on LinkedIn, all the places you'd normally expect. Otherwise do get in touch and we can spread more stuff out, but everything I've shown you today is publicly available.
Okay, and I suppose with what's been in the press and lots of things about storm overflows and state of our rivers, have you done any surveys on that? And do you think that will have a noticeable effect on election results in terms of how the parties are perhaps responding to that issue?
It's really interesting. So I think it's part of a broader infrastructure debate. It's not just rivers, it's potholes, it's roads, it's rail. I think it all, and because the sewerage system is the problem here, and it all does fit together. That sense that everything's kind of a bit dog-eared, and that maybe the government's responsible for that, I think is probably where that fits. Maybe in some local areas, the state of the river or the state of the sea will be a particular issue, but broadly, it's more creating an environment where you feel that everything's a bit down at heel right now, and the sewers are overflowing and the trains aren't running. It's that sort of general grumbling. We see a lot of pessimism right now amongst the public, and I think that's how the rivers topic contributes. It's probably not got the cut through just from a sort of an environmental perspective, but I think it does feed in quite a lot to the sense that things aren't working right at the moment.
For this question to keep moving. What do you think about the tension between people thinking about what we're not too late to doing anything and the political will to do anything? The message of this conference has been that we need to portray messages of hope for people, otherwise they'll switch off. But if they think it's not too late, then it's not an urgent enough issue. So yes, that tension between people thinking that it's not too late to do anything and the political will to do something. Yeah.
That's a really great question, actually. Is right. It's almost like there's a balance there, isn't there, where people feel things are almost out of hand and they need to focus, because that's sort of often how decisions get made. I don't have an answer on that, but I do think that the fatalism point is probably the one to avoid, as you've already said. Even if people think it's, we've got some time, it's probably better than thinking that it's all done for already. Both ways, actually, whether everything's already lost or there's no point. So probably take encouragement that half of people haven't written off the environment yet. But I think that points out how do you motivate people is perennial, basically, and it's a tricky one to think on.
Thank you. And there's a question, or 4 people voted this question. Do you have any data on people's attitudes to nature and wildlife decline?
It's a really great question. I think it's an area where there's less polling, for sure. I think it's quite hard often to answer. I think there's attempts to define whether people understand what biodiversity is, for example, because it's a very complex topic. I think there's some work underway on that. But obviously it's got less cachet, less attention than climate change. Even if we added biodiversity onto our issues index, I doubt it would get the 10% that climate change does. It would really be tricky to register. So actually, it's often a lot more about public dialogue or qualitative type work to try and understand a little bit more. We did some work with the Royal Society about land use a couple of years back, and that was a dialogue project where we got people to really engage with how land is used and how the fact that it's not passive, it's a very active environment people are in, and the impacts that has on the environment and on climate change and everything else. But it's a real undertaking. You've got to be with people, you've got to talk to them for quite a long time, provide them with lots of information and speaking to experts to get them to a level where they can comment on that. So I think we might have some polling, but it's always, particularly on wildlife decline, attitudes to nature, it's going to be very top level. I think what we do know, I think Britons are probably less worried about nature than maybe other countries in Europe. I think I recall something from 2019 on that point. I think it's something people in Britain, I think the attention is on climate change, but trying to think about the whole of the multiple dilemmas is a bit trickier to people. So I guess probably it's less of a priority, I would say, if we were to poll on it, but there's a little bit of a lack of data there.
Yeah, when I was at Bristol City Council, an extra question was put in the quality of life survey. So they had a question about how, are you concerned about climate change or the impact of climate change? And we added in an extra question about, are you concerned about loss of nature? And it actually equaled the number of people. It was the same percentage. It was something like, it was 86% for each one. They leveled up, which was quite surprising to us that it came up equal to concern about climate change. So I think it is, probably important to look, we need to do more surveys, because I think with I think people's access, use of green space during COVID, it really upped people's level of awareness and the importance of green space to them and having access to nature. So yes, it'd be good if people have got more information on polls that are related to that. But I say I know Bristol City Council included it in their quality of life survey.
And it's also, sorry, I'm just going to one more reflection. It's also really interesting because people's perceptions of landscape are just so localized. If you can ask people about climate change, they can think about the world, they can think about sea rise. If you ask people about the natural environment, they're probably thinking about the park around the corner from their house, or, the fields immediately near where they live. And we ask people where else they've been in the country, and, very few people outside of Northern Ireland in the UK have been to Northern Ireland. Very few people have gone even to Scotland if they live in the south of England. It's sort of a real local level understanding, which I think is another obstacle to getting the same sort of polling that we get on climate change.
Yeah, which is a good segue into the next question, because somebody's saying, are you seeing similar trends when you break the UK data down into individual nations, Scotland, Wales, Ireland? Are you seeing, when you do your surveys, is there any noticeable disparity or difference in them?
I think it's quite level, generally, particularly on the level of concern. Obviously, the countries have a slightly different income distribution, slightly different types of people in them, which will affect it slightly. But I do think it's broadly seen quite similarly across the country in terms of people who mention it as an issue, people who don't. We do less in Northern Ireland, but I think it would probably be the same there as well.
Okay. Right, an interesting question here. What sociological data do you think would pair best with environmental data, promote a message and actions for ecological protection and recovery? So what can we use to understand, I suppose, a bit better about our audiences?
That's a good one. It's always, I think it is sort of, it needs to come first. I think it's like a more qualitative, more sociological understanding. We do in this company, we do semiotic analysis sometimes as well. And I think that would be something really interesting to do, because it is so complex, understanding, how people approach it, how people think about environmental claims and products, for example. What denotes greenness? There are a lot of really interesting questions that you could ask. Because then you need to build into those, and we do behavioral science too. That's another really important area. We've done some polling on what people see as the barriers to upgrading their homes to make them more environmentally friendly. And then if you break it down into, is it problems of knowledge? Is it problems of, society? Other people don't do this. Does it seem like it's difficult? We're able to start building a little bit more about what's stopping people from taking action. So that behavioral science angle is quite interesting, I think, because often, with homes, for example, it's as much about it appearing to be difficult than people not having the money. They'll always say they've not got the money, but the bigger obstacles will be, my friends and family aren't doing it. No one's telling me it's important. It looks like it's complicated. And that then gives you some ideas about what are the communication goals you can use to get around those issues. Because as I've shown from my polling, if you ask people, they'll probably just say it's money, but often money covers a lot of other things, which are about, how do I spend the money, or what options are available to me to get the money in order that I can make the change, rather than just being it's too expensive.
Yeah, on that, because that was something I knew, that 52% agreed they would like to make change but can't afford to. And I know there's something in the chat about that. Do you think when people are answering that question, they're thinking about cost of changing their boiler or solar panels rather than the smaller things that do matter about, recycling, buying more sustainable products, just thinking about the sourcing? Do you think when people answer that question, they've got the majority have a perception it's the big things that are very costly rather than thinking the everyday things, like installing a water butt to actually reduce storm water? And
it's a good question. I think probably yes. Overall, people are thinking of things that are expensive or not for them. It might not be boilers. It might just be organic, environmental products that are slightly more expensive, because people think through what they buy the most. So it's almost always in a sort of grocery type context. I think, are you buying the cheapest, or are you buying something more expensive? So I think you're probably thinking there, but I also think that idea of cost should be read in quite a broad sense. It's not literally just the money, it's probably the effort as well.
And sort of linked with that then is the question, have you investigated the intention between an action gap? Is it true to say that people say they want to make changes to be more sustainable, but the number who actually do is much lower?
Yeah, thank you. I see Stu said this is our last question, sadly, but we have investigated it, and it's really difficult. You know, we are opinion pollers. We ask people what they think, and then we, to an extent, believe what they're going to tell us. And that point of action is really, really important, and one that's so much harder to understand, because certainly there's overclaim. We find it in our political polling as well, both ways. If people might have heard of the shy Tories, the idea that people say they're not going to vote Conservative, then do on the day, or vice versa. And you know, we're constantly struggling with the idea of, are people actually telling us what they're going to do? And when it comes to climate change, where some things people say they're going to do are quite complicated, it becomes even more of an issue. And the final thought is just also, it's not only an intention action gap, but there's also what we call a believe true gap. So people are more likely to do the things which they think are more impactful, but actually aren't necessarily. So recycling, changing light bulbs, you know, they're obviously cheaper and easier, but not necessarily as impactful as replacing your boiler. Or you know, driving less or not flying, and people will attribute, you know, perhaps the less impactful steps as being the ones that they think are more important, partially because they think they're easy to do and they actually do them already. But there's a gap between intention and action. There's also a gap between what people think is impactful and what the stats suggest actually is the most impactful thing they could be doing.
Thanks very much, Mike. And thanks everybody for attending the session and for putting the information in the chat and the Q&A. Hope you've enjoyed the session and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.